Book 5, The Second Rebellion. Part 1, The Second Invasion of Britain, 54 BC. 1. In the consulship of Lucius Domitius and Appius Claudius, when Caesar was leaving his winter quarters as usual to go to Italy, he ordered the generals placed in command of the legions to have as many ships as possible built during the winter and the old ones repaired. He specified the dimensions and shape of the new ships. To enable them to be loaded quickly and beached easily, he had them made slightly lower than those which we generally use in the Mediterranean, especially as he had found that owing to the frequent ebb and flow of the tides, the waves in the channel were comparatively small. To enable them, however, to carry a heavy cargo, including a large number of animals, they were made somewhat wider than the ships we use in other waters. They were all to be of a type suitable for both sailing and rowing, an arrangement which was greatly facilitated by their low freeboard. The materials required for fitting them out were to be imported from Spain. On the completion of the assizes in northern Italy, Caesar set out for Illyria, because he heard that the Pirosate were making damaging raids over the border of that province. On his arrival, he ordered the tribes to levy troops and appointed a place for their assembly. When they heard this news, the Pirosate sent representatives to say that their government was not responsible for what had happened and that they were ready to make full reparation for the damage. He accepted their explanation and ordered them to deliver hostages by a certain day, failing which he would make war on them. The hostages were punctually delivered in obedience to his orders, and he then appointed arbitrators to assess the damage sustained by the various communities and fix the reparation. 2. After disposing of this matter and holding his assizes in Illyria, Caesar returned to Italy, and from there went to rejoin the army. On his arrival, he made a tour of all the winter camps and found that, in spite of the serious shortage of materials, the men had worked with such enthusiasm that they had built and equipped 600 vessels of the type described and 28 warships. These would all be ready for launching in a few days. Caesar congratulated the soldiers and the officers who had superintended the work, gave them further instructions, and ordered all the ships to be assembled at Portus Aetius, the starting point for the easiest crossing to Britain, a run of about 30 miles. Leaving a sufficient number of troops to carry out this task, he took 4 legions unencumbered by a baggage train and 800 cavalry and set out for the country of the Treveri, because they would not attend the annual councils of chieftains or submit to his authority, and were alleged to be making overtures to the Germans across the Rhine. 3. The Treveri have much the most powerful cavalry in Gaul, and also a considerable force of infantry. Their territory, will be remembered, borders on the Rhine. 2 rivals were struggling there for supremacy: Indutiomarus and Cingetorix. As soon as news came of Caesar's approach with the legions, Cingetorix presented himself, assured Caesar that he and all his followers would remain loyal to the Roman alliance, and explained the position of affairs among the Treveri. Indutiomarus, however, began to prepare for war, raising forces of cavalry and infantry, and hiding those too young or too old to fight in the huge forest of the Ardennes, which stretches from the Rhine through the middle of the Treverian country to the frontier of the Remi. Some of the other leaders of the tribe, who were friends of Cingetorix, were alarmed by the approach of the Roman army, and since it was not in their power, they said, to help their country, they came to Caesar and petitioned for their personal safety. Indutiomarus was now afraid of being completely isolated, and sent to Caesar to say that the reason why he had not wanted to leave his followers and wait upon him was that by remaining he had a better chance of keeping the tribe loyal. If all the men of rank left the country, the common people in their ignorance might fall into error. In this way he had kept control of his countrymen, and with Caesar's permission would come to his camp and place himself and the tribe under his protection. 4. Caesar understood his motive in saying this and knew what deterred him from prosecuting his original design. Nevertheless, to avoid having to waste the summer there after making all preparations for a campaign in Britain, he told Indutiomarus to present himself with 200 hostages, including his son and all his relations, who were mentioned by name. When these were brought, Caesar reassured him and urged him to remain loyal. But he also summoned the other leaders of the tribe and called on them individually to support King Aeduan. He thought that King Aeduan deserved this help and that it was important to do all he could to increase the power of a man who had proved himself so devoted a friend. This abatement of his influence provoked in Indutiomarus the bitter resentment, which greatly inflamed the hostility that he already felt towards the Romans. 5. After settling this matter, Caesar proceeded with the legions to Portus Aetius. He found that 60 ships which were built in the country of the Meldae had been driven out of their course by a storm and had returned to their starting point. All the rest were completely equipped and ready for sea. 4,000 cavalry from all parts of Gaul assembled at the port, and the leaders of all the tribes. Caesar had decided to leave behind only a few of these who had proved their loyalty, and to take all the rest with him as hostages, because he was afraid of a rising in Gaul during his absence. 6. Among the Gallic leaders was Dumnorix the Aeduan, spoken of above. He was one whom Caesar was particularly determined to keep with him, because he knew him to be a political intriguer, ambitious, bold, and very influential with the Gauls. Moreover, Dumnorix had said in the Aeduan council that Caesar had offered to make him king of the tribe, a statement that was much resented by the Aedui, although they dared not protest to Caesar or ask him to give up the idea. Caesar learned these facts from some Gauls in whose house he had lodged. Dumnorix began by begging hard to be allowed to stay at home, saying that he was unused to sailing and afraid of the sea, and also that he was debarred from leaving the country by religious duties. When he found there was no hope of altering Caesar's determination not to leave him behind, he began to intrigue with the other chiefs, taking them aside one by one, urging them to remain on the continent and working on their fears. He said that Caesar had an ulterior object in thus stripping Gaul of all her leading citizens. He shrank from killing them under the eyes of their countrymen, but his purpose was to put them all to death when he had got them across to Britain. He pledged his word to work with the others for what they saw to be the interest of Gaul, and called on them to take an oath to the same effect. 7. When these facts were reported to Caesar by a number of informants, he decided that in view of the high regard which he had for the Aedui, he ought to do everything possible to restrain Dumnorix and deter him from pursuing his design. And as the man's obsession was clearly increasing, it must be put beyond his power to do any injury to Caesar or to Roman interests. For between 3 and 4 weeks the army was delayed at the port because the northwest wind, the prevailing wind at all seasons on that coast, made it impossible to sail. And in the meantime Caesar took measures to make Dumnorix behave himself, but at the same time to obtain information about any plans he might form. At length, taking advantage of favourable weather, Caesar ordered the infantry and cavalry to embark. But while everyone's attention was occupied with this operation, Dumnorix took some Aeduan horsemen out of the camp without Caesar's knowledge and started for home. On hearing of this, Caesar postponed the sailing. Letting everything else wait, he sent a strong detachment of cavalry to pursue him and bring him back. If he showed fight and refused to obey, their orders were to kill him, since Caesar thought that a man who flouted his authority under his very eyes could not be expected to behave rationally behind his back. On being summoned to return, Dumnorix began to resist, sword in hand, begging his followers to protect him and shouting over and over again that he was a free man and a citizen of a free state. In obedience to Caesar's orders, he was surrounded and killed, and all the Aeduan horsemen returned to the Roman camp. 8. Caesar then set sail, leaving Labienus on the continent with 3 legions and 2,000 cavalry, with orders to guard the ports, provide for a supply of corn, watch events in Gaul, and act as circumstances from time to time might require. Caesar took with him 5 legions and the remaining 2,000 cavalry, and putting out about sunset was at first carried on his way by a light southwesterly breeze. But about midnight the wind dropped, with the result that he was driven far out of his course by the tidal current, and at daybreak saw Britain left behind on the port side. When the set of the current changed, he went with it, and rowed hard to make the part of the island where he had found the best landing places the year before. The soldiers worked splendidly, and by continuous rowing enabled the heavily laden transports to keep up with the warships. When the whole fleet reached Britain about midday, no enemy was to be seen. Caesar discovered afterwards from prisoners that, although large numbers had assembled at the spot, they were frightened by the sight of so many ships, and had quitted the shore to conceal themselves on higher ground. Including those retained from the previous year, and the privately owned vessels built by individuals for their own use, over 800 ships were visible simultaneously. 9. Caesar disembarked his army and chose a suitable spot for a camp. On learning from prisoners where the enemy were posted, he left 10 cohorts and 300 cavalry on the coast to guard the fleet, and marched against the Britons shortly after midnight, feeling little anxiety about the ships because he was leaving them anchored on an open shore of soft sand. The fleet and its guard were put under the command of Quintus Atrius. A night march of about 12 miles brought Caesar in sight of the enemy, who advanced to a river with their cavalry and chariots, and tried to bar his way by attacking from a position on higher ground. Repulsed by his cavalry, they hid in the woods, where they occupied a well-fortified post of great natural strength, previously prepared no doubt for some war among themselves, since all the entrances were blocked by felled trees laid close together. Scattered parties made skirmishing attacks out of the woods, trying to prevent the Romans from penetrating the defences. But the soldiers of the 7th Legion, locking their shields together over their heads and piling up the earth against the fortification, captured the place and drove them out of the woods at the cost of only a few men wounded. Caesar forbade them to pursue far, however, because he did not know the ground, and because he wanted to devote the few remaining hours of the day to the fortification of his camp. 10. The next morning he sent out a force of infantry and cavalry in 3 columns to pursue the fleeing enemy. They had advanced some way and were in sight of the nearest fugitives, when dispatch riders brought news from Atrius of a great storm in the night, by which nearly all the ships had been damaged or cast ashore. The anchors and cables had not held, and the sailors and their captains could not cope with such a violent gale, so that many vessels were disabled by running foul of one another. 11. Caesar at once ordered the legions and cavalry to be halted and recalled. He himself went back to the beach, where with his own eyes he saw pretty much what the messengers and the dispatch described. About 40 ships were a total loss. The rest looked as if they could be repaired at the cost of much trouble. Accordingly, he called out all the skilled workmen from the legions, sent to the continent for more, and wrote to tell Labienus to build as many ships as possible with the troops under his command. Further, although it was a task involving enormous labour, he decided that it would be best to have all the ships beached and enclosed together with the camp by one fortification. This work, although it was continued day and night, took some 10 days to complete. As soon as the ships were hauled up and the camp strongly fortified, Caesar left the same units as before to guard them and returned to the place from which he had come. On arriving there, he found that larger British forces had now been assembled from all sides by Cassiulanus, to whom the chief command and direction of the campaign had been entrusted by common consent. Cassiulanus' territory is separated from the maritime tribes by a river called the Thames, and lies about 75 miles from the sea. Previously he had been continually at war with the other tribes, but the arrival of our army frightened them into appointing him their supreme commander. 12. The interior of Britain is inhabited by people who claim, on the strength of an oral tradition, to be aboriginal. The coast, by Belgic immigrants who came to plunder and make war, nearly all of them retaining the names of the tribes from which they originated, and later settled down to till the soil. The population is exceedingly large, the ground thickly studded with homesteads closely resembling those of the Gauls, and the cattle very numerous. For money they use either bronze or gold coins or iron ingots of fixed weights. Tin is found inland, and small quantities of iron near the coast. The copper that they use is imported. There is timber of every kind as in Gaul, except beech and fir. Hares, fowl, and geese they think it unlawful to eat, but rear them for pleasure and amusement. The climate is more temperate than in Gaul, the cold being less severe. 13. The island is triangular, with one side facing Gaul. One corner of this side, on the coast of Kent, is the landing place for nearly all the ships from Gaul and points east. The lower corner points south. The length of this side is about 475 miles. Another side faces west, towards Spain. In this direction is Ireland, which is supposed to be half the size of Britain and lies at the same distance from it as Gaul. Midway across is the Isle of Man, and it is believed that there are also a number of smaller islands in which, according to some writers, there is a month of perpetual darkness at the winter solstice. Our inquiries on this subject were always fruitless, but we found by accurate measurements with a water clock that the nights are shorter than on the continent. This side of Britain, according to the natives' estimate, is 665 miles long. The third side faces north. No land lies opposite it, but its eastern corner points roughly in the direction of Germany. Its length is estimated at 760 miles. Thus the whole island is 1,900 miles in circumference. 14. By far the most civilized inhabitants are those living in Kent, a purely maritime district, whose way of life differs little from that of the Gauls. Most of the tribes in the interior do not grow corn but live on milk and meat and wear skins. All the Britons dye their bodies with woad, which produces a blue colour, and shave the whole of their bodies except the head and the upper lip. Wives are shared between groups of 10 or 12 men, especially between brothers and between fathers and sons. But the offspring of these unions are counted as the children of the man with whom a particular woman cohabited first. 15. The British cavalry and charioteers had a fierce encounter with our cavalry on the march, but our men had the best of it everywhere and drove them into the woods and hills, killing a good many, but also incurring some casualties themselves by a too eager pursuit. The enemy waited for a time, and then, while our soldiers were off their guard and busy fortifying the camp, suddenly dashed out of the woods, swooped upon the outpost on duty in front of the camp, and started a violent battle. Caesar sent 2 cohorts, the first of their respective legions, to the rescue, and these took up a position close together. But the men were unnerved by the unfamiliar tactics, and the enemy very daringly broke through between them and got away unhurt. That day Quintus Laberius Durus, a military tribune, was killed. The attack was eventually repulsed by throwing in some more cohorts. 16. Throughout this peculiar combat, which was fought in front of the camp in full view of everyone, it was seen that our troops were too heavily weighted by their armour to deal with such an enemy. They could not pursue them when they retreated, and dared not get separated from their standards. The cavalry, too, found it very dangerous work fighting the charioteers, for the Britons would generally give ground on purpose, and after drawing them some distance from the legions, would jump down from their chariots and fight on foot, with the odds in their favour. In engaging their cavalry, our men were not much better off. Their tactics were such that the danger was exactly the same for both pursuers and pursued. A further difficulty was that they never fought in very close order, but in very open formation, and had reserves posted here and there. In this way the various groups covered one another's retreat, and fresh troops replaced those who were tired. 17. Next day the enemy took up a position on the hills at a distance from the camp. They showed themselves now only in small parties, and harassed our cavalry with less vigour than the day before. But at midday, when Caesar had sent 3 legions and all the cavalry on a foraging expedition under his general Gaius Trebonius, they suddenly swooped down on them from all sides, pressing their attack right up to the standards of the legions. The legionnaires drove them off by a strong counterattack and continued to pursue until the cavalry, emboldened by the support of the legions which they saw close behind them, made a charge that sent the natives flying headlong. A great many were killed, and the rest were given no chance of rallying or making a stand or jumping from their chariots. This rout caused the immediate dispersal of the forces that had been assembled from various tribes to Cassivellaunus's aid, and the Britons never again joined battle with their whole strength. 18. On learning the enemy's plan of campaign, Caesar led his army to the Thames in order to enter Cassivellaunus's territory. The river is fordable at one point only, and even there with difficulty. At this place he found large enemy forces drawn up on the opposite bank. The bank was also fenced by sharp stakes fixed along the edge, and he was told by prisoners and deserters that similar ones were concealed in the riverbed. He sent the cavalry across first, and then at once ordered the infantry to follow. But the infantry went with such speed and impetuosity, although they had only their heads above water, that they were attacked at the same moment as the cavalry. The enemy was overpowered and fled from the river bank. 19. Cassivellaunus had now given up all hope of fighting a pitched battle. Disbanding the greater part of his troops, he retained only some 4,000 charioteers with whom he watched our line of march. He would retire a short way from the route and hide in dense thickets, driving the inhabitants and cattle from the open country into the woods wherever he knew we intended to pass. If ever our cavalry incautiously ventured too far away in plundering and devastating the country, he would send all his charioteers out of the woods by well-known lanes and pathways and deliver very formidable attacks, hoping by this means to make them afraid to go far afield. Caesar was thus compelled to keep the cavalry in touch with the column of infantry and to let the enemy off with such devastation and burning as could be done under the protection of the legionnaires, tired as they often were with marching. 20. During this march, envoys arrived from the Trinowantes, about the strongest tribe in southeastern Britain. Mandubracius, a young prince of this tribe, had gone over to the continent to put himself under Caesar's protection, having fled for his life when his father, the king of the Trinowantes, was killed by Cassivellaunus. The envoys promised to surrender and obey Caesar's commands, and asked him to protect Mandubracius from Cassivellaunus and send him home to rule this people as king. Caesar demanded 40 hostages and grain for his troops, and then allowed Mandubracius to go. The Trinowantes promptly sent the required number of hostages and the grain. 21. When they saw that the Trinowantes had been protected against Cassivellaunus and spared any injury on the part of the Roman troops, several of the tribes, the Ceni-Magni, Segontiaci, Ancalites, Bibroci, and Cassi, sent embassies and surrendered. From them Caesar learned that he was not far from Cassivellaunus' stronghold, which was protected by forests and marshes and had been filled with a large number of men and cattle. The Britons apply the term strongholds to densely wooded spots fortified with a rampart and trench, to which they retire in order to escape the attacks of invaders. He marched to the place with his legions, and found that it was of great natural strength and excellently fortified. Nevertheless, he proceeded to assault it on 2 sides. After a short time, the enemy proved unable to resist the violent attack of the legions and rushed out of the fortress on another side. A quantity of cattle was found there, and many of the fugitives were captured or killed. 22. While these operations were proceeding in his territory, Cassivellaunus sent envoys to Kent ordering the 4 kings of that region, Cingetorix, Carwilius, Taximagulus, and Sigowax, to collect all their troops and make a surprise attack on the naval camp. When these forces appeared, the Romans made a sortie, in which, without suffering any loss, they killed a great many of them and captured Dumnorix, a leader of noble birth. On receiving news of this action, Cassivellaunus, alarmed by so many reverses, by the devastation of his country, and above all by the defection of his allies, sent envoys to Caesar to obtain terms of surrender, employing Commius as an intermediary. Caesar had decided to return to the continent for the winter, for fear any sudden rising should break out in Gaul. The summer, too, was nearly over, and he knew that the Britons could easily hold out for the short time that remained. Accordingly, he granted Cassivellaunus's request for terms, demanding hostages, fixing an annual tribute to be paid by the Britons to the Roman government, and strictly forbidding Cassivellaunus to molest Mandubracius or the Trinowantes. 23. As soon as the hostages were delivered, he led the army back to the coast, where he found the ships repaired. He had them launched, and as he had a large number of prisoners, and some of the ships had been destroyed by the storm, decided to make the return voyage in 2 trips. It happened that of all these large fleets, which made so many voyages in this and the preceding year, not a single ship with troops on board was lost, while very few of the vessels coming over empty from the continent, i.e. those which had returned to Gaul after landing troops in Britain, and 60 that Labienus had built after the start of the expedition, reached their destination, nearly all the rest being forced back to land. After waiting a long time for them in vain, Caesar was afraid of being prevented from sailing by the approaching season of the equinox, and so had to pack the men more tightly than usual on the ships he had. The sea becoming very calm, he set sail late in the evening and brought all the fleet safely to land at dawn.